Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar on sound sleep. Before we get started, I'm going to introduce myself and Amanda as well, who's moderating behind the scenes. The chat box is open and you're welcome to insert any questions or any comments that you have along the next half hour, and Amanda will be answering any product questions as they come up. As well as saving the questions that are a little bit more pertinent to the presentation itself to the end of the webinar. All right, so without further ado, I'll talk a little bit about myself and then we will dive right in. So my name is Dr. Emma Lee. I'm a naturopathic doctor and I practice in Vancouver on the main shore or the mainland. And I have a focus that's primarily on women's health. So meaning that I see everything under the umbrella of women's health. Most of my patients are within, I think, their 30s to 60s. So lots of hormonal concerns, lots of digestive concerns, lots of things to do with the menstrual cycles, fertility, perimenopause, menopause, etc. And I am super passionate about tonight's talk. It is something that I feel like is one of the pillars of health. And so whenever I'm chatting with patients regarding long-term success and long-term health, it's a trifecta of diet, lifestyle, and sleep. And sleep is definitely one of the more elusive ones because there are so many different factors when it comes to optimization of sleep. We'll touch on a few of the most common ones tonight, and we'll also talk about obviously treatment for those concerns. But just know that it's a very complex topic and it's one that we can really go down a deep rabbit hole for. So why is sleep important? I think we all know instinctively that it is. It essentially affects every single aspect of health. So whether you're talking about physiological repair, tissue repair, immune function, mood, mental health, consolidation of learning, creativity, memory, all of these are impacted by sleep. And there really is no uncertainty in the research regarding how much sleep we need. I think a lot of us pride ourselves on being either like night owls or being super high functioning and being able to get by on like 6-7 hours of sleep. But the research is really debunking that. And we really, on average, need about 8 hours. Some of us need a little bit more, closer to 9. And the fact that as we age, sleep is a little bit harder to come by, or that sleep tends to be a little bit shorter, is not really a physiological phenomenon that can be explained by just aging. It's really a pathological process. And so if you're not getting comfortably 8 hours of sleep per night, I think there needs to be a discussion regarding why that is. Okay. So similarly to the fact that sleep is complex, sleep also, there are a lot of factors that feed into sleep. And so this is just a little bit of an excerpt into some of the potential contributors as to why you're not sleeping appropriately, either difficulty falling asleep or difficulty staying asleep. But we'll touch on the ones that are a little bit more, I think, ubiquitous. So they're bolded. So dietary practices, blood sugar regulation, stress, and mood are some big ones. But for sure, if you are someone who is still experiencing menstrual cycles, or if you're going through menopause or andropause, which is kind of the male equivalent of menopause, hormone fluctuations can have an impact on sleep. Things like whether or not you're sick, recently sick, just getting out of a sickness, or even just having inflammation from like a seasonal allergy perspective, that can impact sleep. The gut microbiome can impact sleep, sleep biomechanics, so the way that you're sleeping can definitely impact sleep as well, etc. Okay, so if we're talking about stress, and I picked stress as the one that I wanted to focus on a little bit more in detail because I think we can all relate to this one. Why it impacts sleep is as follows. So on a 24-hour scale, if we're talking about the two primary hormones of sleep, we're really looking at the diurnal pattern of cortisol and melatonin. Melatonin, some of us know it as a sleepy hormone. Cortisol, some of us know it as a stress hormone. But I think cortisol gets a bad rap because of the fact that there's been so much correlation between cortisol and stress. It's not always bad. In fact, it's really, really necessary for daily function. It's our get up and go hormone. So these two hormones function on a little bit of a teeter-totter. They function in tandem to each other. They're influenced by each other's levels, and they in turn influence the other hormones' levels. So when we're talking about daytime, our cortisol should be relatively low in the early mornings. So when I'm talking about early mornings, if let's say, but for example, you get up pretty consistently at 6 a.m., then cortisol should be relatively low in the hours leading up to 6 a.m., but should start to rise. And once it reaches a threshold, that's when you notice yourself waking up, and cortisol should rise and peak in the mid-morning. And so it gets you up and going. It gets you kind of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and ready for the day. It's kind of like nature's natural caffeine. And then as the day progresses, that's when you should see that really nice downward curvature in that slope. And cortisol should slowly decrease over the day until it reaches its lowest point in the evening, which is in turn what allows melatonin to rise. And melatonin, you can see, rises really quickly on this graph. It's what allows us to fall asleep, and melatonin stays high throughout the night so that we stay asleep. And these two hormones function on that 24-hour scale in a very rhythmic way. But these two hormones can definitely be impacted by stress and by other factors that are happening. So factors that impact stress, or I should say, pardon me, stress itself impacts cortisol. So in addition to this very lovely 24-hour graph of what happens to cortisol, whenever we're feeling stressed, our adrenal glands squirt out a little bit of cortisol. So you can imagine, and I'm so sorry, like my PowerPoint skills did not allow me to animate this graph. I really wish I could, because it would be lovely for me to show you what a really chronically stressed person's cortisol curves looks like. But essentially imagine that it's not that beautiful slope downward throughout the day. So for example, if at noontime you get a call from your boss and it's a giant like last minute meeting because there's a work crisis, instead of going slowly down, cortisol all of a sudden spikes. And depending on whether or not that stress gets resolved, that cortisol doesn't necessarily come down. So if cortisol spikes too often, spikes too high, or remains elevated throughout the day when it should be coming down, that can suppress melatonin production. And melatonin does not see that beautiful rise early in the evening. So you have that difficulty falling asleep, or even difficulty staying asleep. So from a naturopathic medicine perspective, what we can do is we can definitely test your cortisol pattern to see what it looks like throughout a 24-hour cycle. So this is an example of a test that we would run in clinic. And you can see on this test that there's a range. There's a lower threshold and an upper threshold, and within that range there's what's considered ideal. I've definitely seen cortisol curves that don't even make it within this range and are just either all over the place, sustained elevation throughout the day, or sustained depression throughout the day, which is more of a picture of adrenal burnout when you're not producing enough cortisol. And so this can give us a really good understanding of, is cortisol having an impact on your sleep? Is it because of cortisol dysregulation that you're seeing a concurrent dysregulation in melatonin, or is it something else? This I find can be also really useful as a test to figure out if you're someone who's waking up in the middle of the night for no reason and having a difficult time getting back to sleep. Is it because you're experiencing either a rise in cortisol that happens too early in the middle of the night? So rather than cortisol starting to rise at 4, you're seeing that rise be initiated at like 2 a.m.? Or are you actually experiencing spikes in cortisol throughout the night that are waking you up? And that can give us a little bit of a hint in terms of, is it a stress response? Or is it actually a blood sugar regulation response? And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the piece about diet, but there is a very intimate relationship between cortisol, our stress hormone, and blood sugar regulation. Okay. And then as kind of just like a little bit of an overview of what I talk about often in clinic with patients who have difficulty falling asleep, is I talk about the importance of having a nighttime routine. So similarly to the idea of making sure that your stress response is optimized throughout the day, really paying attention to what you do for yourself to wind down in the evening can really help your metabolism of cortisol, but also help foster that melatonin curve that should be increasing at the same time. So when I talk about a bedtime routine, I like to be not prescriptive. I like to give people the idea that rather than thinking that you absolutely must do like A, B, C, and D in order to fall asleep, you should think about it as a way to engage with your routine and have fun with your routine. So you can take a look at, different sleep hygiene practices, whether it be like having a bath every night, stretching every night, yoga every night, and pick and choose things that appeal to you and customizing that menu for yourself to choose from so that you can really be specific in terms of responding to what the day's demand was like. So if it's a really busy day, rather than being able to rely on the excuse of, oh, I just don't have time to do my bedtime routine tonight, but approaching it with a mindset of, no, I get to choose from this menu. It's an a la carte menu. And so I don't have time for yoga. I don't have time for a bath, but maybe I have time for a cup of tea. And maybe I have time to read, a couple of pages on my book that I keep by my nightside table, etc. But there are two main things that are really important. One is routine. So it doesn't matter what you do every single night, but as long as you're doing something, as long as you're following some sort of schedule, so setting a little bit of a bedtime for yourself is very helpful because our bodies really like routine. Our brains crave it and anticipate it. The brain is the source of the hormone melatonin. It's made in the brain. And so being able to give your brain cues of, okay, like I'm shutting the lights down at around 8 p.m. I'm turning off my computer. This is kind of the time when I start my wind down practices. Your brain loves that, and it'll remember to make melatonin preferentially at a certain time of the night. And then the other piece is making sure that you're not exposed and overexposed to light. So melatonin is intimately tied to light exposure because we have links between our eyeballs and the part of the brain which is called the pineal gland, which makes melatonin. As long as there's light hitting our eyeballs, there's a break on the pineal gland, and our brain essentially is incapable of making melatonin, even if you have all the other pieces in place. Even if cortisol is low and your routine is on and it's 8 p.m. and your brain knows what to do. So you absolutely need to have very minimal light exposure. I usually recommend nothing more than like a reading lamp. So for sure, like no overhead lamps. And the quality of the light is really important as well. So warm light, red tone lights, things that mimic kind of light that you see in nature if we were living in a non-modern world. So, fire in the evening is a very red light, is more appropriate than blue light. So blue light primarily from screens. If you absolutely must use a screen, I typically recommend that you use either blue light blocking glasses, or there's a really great app that you can download for free. I don't know if you can see it if it's too small on the screen, but it's essentially called Lux, Lux. And what it does is it changes both the tone of the light from a blue to a red, but also the lux capacity of that light emission. So how intense that light is that's coming from your screen. And you can definitely time it either to the time of the day or even to mimic the time of the year that we're in. So you can choose a seasonal setting so that in the winter time, that change from blue to warm light or red light happens a little bit earlier to mimic the sun going down. And then that sort of change happens a little bit later in the summertime as well. It's a fantastic app. You can have it on your cell phone, on your computer, on basically all of your screens and devices at home. And then conversely, when you wake up in the morning, first thing in the morning, the most powerful thing that you can do to help and shut off that melatonin production and therefore encourage that cortisol get up and go hormone is light, bright light exposure. So I typically say 20 minutes outdoor is best. Obviously, right now, that's pretty unbearable for most of us on the West Coast. It's very cold. It's also not very light outside when we're supposed to be up. And so this is where something like a happy light or a happy lamp can really come into play. And you can just turn it on for 20 minutes in the morning while you're like going about making your coffee and your morning routine. Caffeine, that's another one. Limiting caffeine intake in the morning can help with cortisol production. Too much caffeine suppresses cortisol. So that would be another one to watch out for. If you're feeling like you need to rely heavily on caffeine to get up and go in the morning, this might be a clue that you're maybe not making enough cortisol in the morning. And so coming to see an ND or even just playing around with like slowly weaning yourself off of caffeine to give your body the time to adjust to make more cortisol can be really really nice, and it might give you more clues in terms of whether or not there's something else going on. Okay. Diet, how to eat for better sleep. The best research out there is for a modified Mediterranean diet. So lots of whole fruits, whole veggies, more pescatarian sources of protein. Dairy is good, red meats not so much. And then making sure that when you're looking at your plate that you're visually dividing it into thirds, almost like a peace sign. 1/3 of your plate should be proteins, and that can be whatever protein that you prefer. The other third of your plate should be healthy fats. And then the last third of your plate, you should kind of think about it in kind of two halves of that last third. One half of it should be complex carbohydrates. So things like dark leafy greens, non-starchy root vegetables. And then the other half can be more of your whole grains, your starchy root vegetables, things like yams, sweet potatoes, etc. The reason why this works so well for sleep is because this has been shown to be the best way to achieve healthy blood sugar regulation. So remember when I talked about how there's an intimate link between cortisol and blood sugar regulation? Whenever we eat something that causes our blood sugar to yo-yo, meaning that it spikes and then it crashes, that crash is very stressful on the body. Our bodies senses that as kind of a red light or a red alert, and it will excrete extra cortisol in response to that crash in blood sugar in order to bring sugar back into circulation. So there are lots of ways if you're someone who's an aficionado and like blood sugar regulation and like time restricted eating and different diets, there's lots of ways that we can address blood sugar regulation, but just from a research perspective, the modified Mediterranean diet is one that's most appropriate for the biggest swath of the population, the general population. The other thing that you can think about is also timing your carbohydrates. So cortisol should be high in the morning, like we saw. And concurrently, in order to support that rise, minimizing carbohydrates can be really helpful. So things like high fat, high protein breakfast, like eggs, avocado on like a seedy loaf, or even like a smoothie with a protein shake can be really good. I typically recommend aiming for 20 to 30 grams of protein at breakfast. It can look like a lot if you're just relying on one protein source. Like for example, eggs, you need about 4 to 5 eggs to get to 20 to 30 grams of protein, depending on the size of your eggs. So for most people, it's better to vary up the sources of your protein. So if you're a toast eater with your eggs, you could do 2 eggs, 2 slices of the Sprouted Hills, the Big 16 bread. That's probably the most protein rich bread out there on the market right now that's readily available. It's 6 grams of protein per slice of bread. And so that typically will get you up to like 20 grams of protein if you're also sprinkling your eggs with like hemp hearts and or if you're having just like a little bit of nuts and seeds on the side as a snack. And then as you're progressing through the day, as your cortisol is starting to drop, you can start to layer on a little bit of complex carbohydrates. So at lunchtime, 1 fist size is really appropriate. And then at dinner time, that's when you can have a plate that looks like what's on the screen, which is a little bit more complex carbohydrates. Limiting your dinner or your last snack of the day to at least 3 hours before bedtime can also be really helpful. And there's a little caveat here. This is only if you're starting this with really good blood sugar regulation, you're not already diabetic. If you're someone who is struggling or on the road to diabetes or are managing diabetes, this might not be appropriate. And for those of you who have that consideration, that I would recommend having like a healthy, high fat, high protein snack before bedtime to help with continuous blood sugar regulation throughout the night. Okay, so we get to the fun stuff now. So what herbs are appropriate for what types of glucose, blood sugar, cortisol regulation, and sleep regulation? So the 2 products from Harmonic Arts that are really, really helpful for basically anyone are the reishi and the dream tea. Reishi is really helpful for blood sugar regulation and for helping preserve a really healthy blood sugar regulation. It's an adaptogenic. It's really helpful for modulating our stress response, so helping with that beautiful cortisol curve. And it's just something that's very safe to take long term. So there are very few contraindications or reasons why you wouldn't be able to take reishi. But for sure, if you've ever had like a side effect from any mushroom product, that might be something that you might consider avoiding. Dream tea has chamomile, skullcap, passion flower, oat straw, catnips. They're all very gentle sedatives. And when I say a sedative, I'm not talking about like something that's going to knock you out and you're going to feel groggy from the day after. Usually in the herbal realm, when we're talking about like sedatives, it has a different connotation than, let's say, a pharmaceutical sedative. And so for chamomile, skullcap, passion flower, oat straw, these are all herbs that I would consider very gentle in their effects. Some of these help to increase certain neurotransmitters or brain chemicals that are very calming on the nervous system. So for example, chamomile is really, really great at increasing tryptophan and serotonin and melatonin. These are all kind of amino acids that are precursors for each other. So tryptophan turns into serotonin, turns into melatonin, and so it can help with a little bit of that endogenous melatonin release. And the other reason why I love teas is because it can be part of that bedtime routine and a bedtime ritual. So having a cup of tea can be really calming on the nervous system, and there's a trick to brewing medicinal tea. So rather than just having a mug sitting out kind of with the tea bag in the open or with your tea ball in the open, I always recommend brewing your tea really hot and then covering your mug. So hot water, almost boiling water into the mug, and then cover it right away. The reason why is because a lot of these active compounds that have that sedative effect are contained in the volatile oil that gets that typically get steamed away. So they're basically evaporating it, or it being evaporated, and you're not getting the benefits as much as if you're covering, letting it sit for a good 5-10 minutes, and then before you drink, letting the condensation drip back into the tea so that you're actually getting all the medicinal ingredients in your product. Okay. And how do you know when you need a little bit more support? So when you need to reach for products that are maybe a little bit more heavy hitting. So the symptoms of long-standing stress are diverse. You can take a look on the screen. But essentially, if you've been experiencing any type of disrupted sleep for more than 3 months, I feel like you would be a good candidate for something that's maybe a little bit more powerful than the other two agents that we've talked about on the previous slide. So if you're finding it consistently difficult to fall asleep, stay asleep, or really difficult to wake up, or you're experiencing any kind of symptom of cortisol dysregulation, so low energy in the morning, or like really intense energy crashes in the afternoon, and then that sort of paradoxical like burst in energy that you're wired and tired. So those would all be really good indicators that maybe the stress has been long-standing enough that it's now not just kind of, like once in a while you're having difficulty sleeping, but you're starting to experience more entrenched changes in your patterns of cortisol and melatonin release. And this would be a great place to maybe look at products like the Feel Calm tincture and the Adapt tea. So the Feel Calm tincture has valerian, skullcap, passion flower, motherwort, and hops. Valerian is a nervous system relaxant. It's a very strong sedative when we're talking about herbal sedatives. The one piece of caution that I would give for the Feel Calm tincture is in about 30% of the population, this is just from kind of clinical experience, I feel like 30% of the population has a paradoxical reaction or the opposite reaction to valerian. And unfortunately, there's no way of predicting who's going to be part of that population. You just kind of have to try it. But if you try the Feel Calm tincture and you're like, actually, that made me more awake, I felt more energized after taking it, then that's not the right product for you. And it's most likely because of that reaction to valerian. But otherwise, Feel Calm tincture would be a great product to have on kind of your nightside table. I would take this either straight or in a little bit of water diluted if you're feeling like straight is a little bit too strong, 30 to 60 minutes before your desired bedtime. And then similarly, teas can also be really wonderful because you can build that into your bedtime routine. And the Adapt tea would be what I would choose if you need a little bit of a stronger option. It has ashwagandha, eleuthero, rhodiola, schisandra, licorice, Indian sarsaparilla, holy basil, and reishi. So you're seeing a few more adaptogenic herbs. Ashwagandha, eleuthero are specifically really great at regulating cortisol dysregulation, so helping with cortisol contributing to lack of sleep. Rhodiola is really great for improving restlessness, for improving mood. So if you're starting to see stress impacting mood, whether it be irritability, depression, anxiety, rhodiola can be a really great one. I love the Indian sarsaparilla because it's a great anti-inflammatory and it balances hormones as well. So we know that with any long-standing sleep dysregulation, we start to see more inflammation in the body because you're not having as much time to kind of rest and clean. The immune system isn't as efficient as if it would be when you're experiencing great sleep. And so the Indian sarsaparilla can be really helpful for that. This is another one that is really, really useful if you're seeing sleep dysregulation during periods of hormonal imbalances, such as in perimenopause. And perimenopause can happen up to a decade prior to the actual cessation of periods. So I would say for anyone in their 40s that's kind of wondering what's going on, is it perimenopause, is it not? This would be a great place to start. One piece of caution is with the licorice, it can raise blood pressure a little bit. So if you're someone who is on blood pressure medications or you've been told to watch your blood pressure, I may recommend that you avoid this one, even though at this dose, I wouldn't be super concerned with the licorice, but still it can raise blood pressure. And so I would just recommend maybe seeking an alternative, maybe starting with the Feel Calm tincture first. Okay. And then lastly, just as a little bit of a precursor, maybe a little bit of a teaser in terms of what we're going to cover next at a following webinar in the spring, is hormones. So we talked about cortisol and melatonin, which are both hormones, but sex hormones can also play an impact on sleep. And this is something that I love chatting about with my female patients. And this is because progesterone has a very calming effect on your nervous system. It crosses the blood-brain barrier. Our brain converts it into a sedating hormone called allopregnanolone. And this might be why, if for those of you who notice that in the week or 10 days leading up to your period, that's when you notice sleep dysregulations or insomnia, it might be because progesterone isn't where it should be. It's not high as high as it should be. Or you're experiencing, changes in your menstrual cycles, like your menstrual cycles are lengthening or shortening, and as a result, you're also experiencing insomnia. This could be a clue that hormones are impacting sleep. And that brings us to the conclusion of this webinar. So thank you so much for joining us. We're going to open it up to Q&A. I'll have Amanda jump on and turn on her mic and let me know if there's been any questions that came on as I was speaking. For those of you who need to leave, feel free. This recording or this webinar is being recorded, and so the recording will be uploaded onto the Harmonic Arts website. So you can always maybe check back in for the Q&A at a later date.
Thank you, Emma. That was fantastic. We have one question here that you did slightly touch on, but you might want to add anything else. But do you recommend using light therapy lamps in the winter?
Yes, I feel like if you are needing to get up at a certain time when it's still dark out, it can be incredibly helpful. I know there's a lot of, I think, like general discussion regarding light therapy and like vitamin D production. From that perspective, I haven't seen it be super helpful. I feel like our needs for vitamin D are so much higher than what a light lamp can provide. But for sure, in terms of like getting our cortisol curve going and then putting a brake on the melatonin to stop, the morning grogginess, the light lamp can be very, very helpful.
Great, thank you.